cold case detective. He'll be talking in a couple moments. I want to take you back to another Thursday back in 1983. It was April 7th of 1983. It was mid-afternoon, around 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And in the Ridge Manor area, there were 3 little girls who were home alone. One of their parents who had who was watching them went to the store for just a few minutes, and in that time that the parent was gone, one of the young girls heard a knock on the door and answered the door. And there was a strange man that none of them knew who was at the door. And he proceeded to ask them some questions about the house and just general things like anybody would do coming to the door asking about things. And the little girl, I believe it was the 9-year-old, there was a 9-year-old and a 12-year-old who were sisters, and then another 10-year-old who was there playing. The 9-year-old started talking to the gentleman, got the 12-year-old involved, and they talked with him a few moments and thought they were done and closed the door. A few minutes later, this individual came into the house through the garage. Now remember, these little girls were probably doing the things that most little girls do after school, watching TV, maybe having an afternoon snack or playing with dolls. And this individual came in through the garage armed with a knife and took one of the little girls at knife point and instructed the 12-year-old that if she did not do exactly what he said, he was going to injure or kill one or both of the younger girls in the house. He then took this 12-year-old into the bedroom, and while the other 2 were there kind of holding them hostage, he did some unmentionable things to that 12-year-old little girl. The 12-year-old girl, a brave little girl, was able to give us some information about the individual, and the others, they all pretty much gave us the same story, that this was a white male between the ages of 30 and 50, but they couldn't give us a whole lot more information than that. One thing the 12-year-old did say that was kind of ironic was that the suspect was unusually calm in the way he committed this brutal crime. And because of that reason, we certainly want to get the information out, and Detective Loigren's going to be entering information into ViCAP because, as you'll find out later, this person, this was not their first violent act, and we hopefully will be able to solve some more cases because of the hard work of Detective Loigren. And for those of you who don't know, there's a program, it's called ViCAP. It's the Violent Criminal Apprehension Program, and it puts traits of crimes into the computer if you get leads on a crime, and puts it in there so other detectives can look and maybe help get leads in their cases. So that's part of the reason why we're doing this today, is to make sure that we get the information out there on this particular case. But because it was a complete stranger and it was very young girls, and it was way before DNA testing, there wasn't a whole lot to go on. But the investigators back then did take quite a bit of evidence, bed sheets and clothes and so forth, and were able to get some evidence, semen and so forth, from the crime scene. The tests at that time, it's important to put this in perspective, back in 1983, which is actually before any current employee at the sheriff's office was working. Back in 1983, if you were able to develop anything from bodily fluids, it was typically blood type or something like that. It would help you exclude a suspect, but it was very difficult to narrow down suspects. So, but they still took the evidence and collected it. And it sat dormant for several years, up until about 2005, when that evidence was submitted for DNA testing. And Detective Loigren was just telling me, he believes it was around 2005 when we got our first full DNA profile. Of course, you could imagine the detectives were probably pretty excited that we actually had DNA in such a horrific case. The bad news was that it did not hit in any of the databases, national or state databases for DNA. So we weren't able to pursue it. And again, it laid dormant for another 10 to 13 years. As I said, the case detective in this particular case is George Logan. He's standing to my right, your left. In addition to being assigned slightly less than 24 cold cases, he also regularly gets called out and assigned to hot cases, so you can imagine he stays pretty busy. But fortunately for us, Detective Loigren also works very, very hard at staying up to date on the latest advances in testing cold cases and the evidence associated with those. And recently he was made aware of a company, namely Parabon Nanolabs. We typically call it Parabon. And they're a DNA technology company in Virginia specializing in DNA phenotyping and genetic genealogy. Detective Loigren, along with individuals from the Florida Department of Law Enforcement Crime Laboratory, DNA International, which is a private forensic laboratory in Deerfield Beach, Florida, all work together with Parabon to help identify one or more suspects. And what law enforcement agencies do is they use the Parabon Snapshot DNA phenotyping service, they call it Snapshot, and genetic genealogy services to narrow suspect lists and generate leads in criminal investigations. Using the DNA, they basically tell us trait predictors for the associated suspect, things like the person's ancestry, their eye color, their hair color, their skin color, their freckling, and their face shape. Parabon's research developed a profile that was consistent with the information we obtained for the young girls back in 1983. Additionally, Parabon conducted a genetic genealogy analysis and provided the results to the Hernando County Sheriff's Office. Through very, very high-tech and some proprietary technology, Parabon is usually able to narrow the field of suspects from, in this case, a person who back in 1983 was between 30 and 50 years old and was a white male. They usually narrow that down to several members in a family tree, sometimes dozens, even maybe up to 100 possible suspects. Fortunately for us, in this case, we caught a break. They narrowed it down to one individual they thought was very likely to have committed this crime. Of course, it didn't stop there. But what that person we identified was William Lewis Nichols. He's a white male. His date of birth was 7/18 of 1941. And he had a history. Back in Wisconsin on October 8th of 1958, and I believe it's called Wampum, Wisconsin, he was arrested for attempted rape. He actually went to prison, and he was released on parole in October of 1961, so about 3 years after the original rape. I'm sorry, he was released on parole, and then he was discharged. He was completely taken off probation in January 1st of 1964. So again, many, many years ago. In March of 1972, he was again charged with rape, and that was back in March 24th of 1972, and he was, ironically, and I will tell you records back from 58 and the early 70s are all but non-existent. So we're having a lot of trouble finding out the particulars of these cases. But in March of 1972, he was again arrested for rape, and he was found incompetent to stand trial and was actually sent to a mental institution sometime later. We're not sure exactly how this fits in, but later that same year in September, he was arrested in Madison, Wisconsin. So the second one in 72 was from Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Then again in Madison, Wisconsin, he was again arrested on 3 counts of rape, and that was dismissed. So we're not sure if that was because he was incompetent or what. We're still trying to determine that. So back in the late 50s up through the early 70s, this particular individual was obviously committing rapes. So detectives learned, unfortunately, that this person died in October 23rd of 1998 in Orlando, Florida. But we did find out that at the time of this rape back in 1983, he was self-employed and he did a vending machine service business. So he was traveling around Central Florida quite a bit back in 1983 when this young 12-year-old girl was raped. Since he was deceased, it was going to be difficult for us to obtain DNA directly from the suspect. But investigators, namely Detective Loigren, was able to get a DNA sample from a cooperating family member. And the scientists who tested that family member's DNA compared it to the sample collected in 1983 and advised that there's about a 99.99% chance that Nichols is the one, as opposed to any random person, was the person who left the evidence at the scene that day back in 1983. We believe that fact, coupled with his proximity to the crime and, of course, his criminal history, I think we can comfortably say beyond a reasonable doubt that Detective Loigren solved this case. We, of course, were withholding any specific information about the victim to protect her privacy. And although she's a grown woman now in her 40s, she's been able to move on with her life and have a family. The 12-year-old little girl inside that grown woman still has to deal with the impact of this horrific crime on her life. I do want to allow Detective Loigren to spend a couple minutes talking about his interaction with the victim and what happened when he was able to give her the news that this monster was not going to be able to ever hurt her, her family member, or any other little girl ever again. So I'm going to turn it over to Detective Loigren to talk a little. He'll be happy to answer some questions about the particulars of this case, but I think if you give him a couple minutes to talk a little bit about when he was able to give the news to the victim, I think you'll find it interesting, heartwarming, and heart-wrenching at the same time. So Detective Loigren, it's all yours.
Thanks, Sheriff. I will say that I'll try to keep it brief anyway. So myself and one of my volunteers went to go speak with the victim in this case. And this is 35 years in the past already. So the physical damage is long but gone, but the psychological effects of something like this last forever. So myself and one of my volunteers went up there and to where the victim now lives and went to introduce myself, and I wanted to give her the news firsthand. So when we get to the house and I introduce myself and tell her we're from Hernando County, she immediately dismisses one of her children and says, you know, I know what this is about, and begins to tell me, hey, you know, I'm trying to put this all behind me. It's been a long time. You guys are never going to catch the guy. And she wasn't trying to be rude, but she's done with it. She's trying to put it out of her mind. So I stopped her right there and I said, hold on, I know you're going to have questions for me. Let me just stop you where we're at and just let me tell you, through advances in modern technology, we were able to identify the individual. And I'm here to tell you that we know who he is and to see if you want to speak about it. So immediately her jaw dropped, and now she said, hey, let's sit down. So we sat down and I told her what steps I had taken through the time I've been assigned the cold case and the work that other detectives did before me and the original deputies on the street and detectives preserving the evidence properly and everything's worked out. And told her, and hey, this is the guy. In fact, I asked her first and said, would you like to know his name? Would you like to see a picture? And she said yes, because I didn't want to have to make things worse for her. But I did this on New Year's Eve, so my mindset was, let's finish this now for the year, and she can start a new year off putting this hopefully behind her forever. And she wanted to see a photo, and she wanted to know who he was. I explained everything to her, and she was very happy, very thankful, and now she can put it all behind her. So it was very satisfying to me to have a good, positive closing on this case, even though she'll still have those memories, at least hopefully now we can make it a little better for her with the positive outcome. And she doesn't have to worry about this individual ever coming back, coming around her home or victimizing her children or anybody else, which was one of the thoughts she had for years. So, that's it.
Anybody have any questions?
Were any of the other children injured, the other two children injured?
No, he, when he entered the house, he did hold the knife to the 9-year-old and threatened to kill her, and then all the other girls if they spoke.
Did you show her the picture? Did she recognize it?
I showed her, not this particular one. We found this yesterday looking for further photos, but the photo I did show her, she was unable to recognize the guy. The photos I had at the time were about probably 10 to 12 or 13 years from when he offended on her, so she wasn't able to recognize him at that point.
Can you say what Nichols actually did to the girl?
He raped her. Yes, ma'am.
Do they know if he committed any other crimes after the 1983 incident? Have they taught him to crimes after that? I may have missed it in your discussion.
No, that's unfortunately because records over the years, now that we can keep more information, it seems we're getting rid of it. But you're talking about in the past, the 1958 and 72 crimes, we're trying to find that information out to see if it'll lead us to other things. I also took some steps performing some other computer checks to try to see if this individual fits any other profiles of other crimes that occurred after '83. In fact, the victim in this case asked me when I spoke with her, did he hurt anybody else after me? So we've already sent out a teletype, which is just a brief synopsis of this crime and the individual we've identified, and that he was in Central Florida. In fact, we sent it out statewide, fitting his description and his method, the MO of what he did. So as of today, we're still waiting to see if there's any responses back. Again, you're talking about over the last 35 years. Now, other cold case guys, if there are, in those agencies have to go back and look at old sexual battery cases or attempts and try to see if this man fits their description.
Why did he target this home, these girls? Did he live or work in the area?
We know that he did work for a vending route. It was self-owned by himself and another individual at times, and he had free reign to run around Central Florida. As to specifically why these girls, they don't know, and to this date I don't know, because unfortunately he's not on this planet anymore for me to ask him.
You did ask some questions about if the man was home and so forth.
Yes, when he came into the house at knife, when he grabbed the little 9-year-old at knife point, he asked, is your father home? Whether he knew there was a man in the house or just assumed, especially given the time in 1983.
You had satisfaction in identifying the individual. Were you frustrated in that you couldn't have him face trial?
I wouldn't say I'm frustrated. You know, I got to look at both sides of the coin. Yes, I would love for him to still be alive so we could put him in prison and he could spend the rest of his days there. But in speaking with the victim, I think it saves her all this, I would say trouble, but just whether it's embarrassment or just to have all these details. If she had to stand trial and then go up and testify and recount all these details specifically, would be very, I think it would probably be further damaging to her psychologically, even though it would be a positive outcome, I would believe.
Can you explain a little bit more about how the advanced DNA system was able to identify the suspect if his DNA wasn't in the system?
So, in this type of testing, since we're in law enforcement being able to branch out into some other areas, and I'll keep it kind of general, basically we have our state system, CODIS, which is for DNA of offenders. There's a missing persons database, there's an offender database, and then there's the same database that is throughout the country. This is a separate database that we were able to, through Parabon, access and retrieve this DNA of family members. And then, as the sheriff said, genetically, through genealogy, have genealogists go through it and narrow the field. In this particular case, we're very fortunate that this man was the only child of a particular man and woman. Yes, ma'am.
Did you take the time or happen to find out anything about his background? For example, was he married at the time? Had he ever been married? Did he have kids? Maybe, did you find anything about him personally besides his, his record?
Well, I did meet with a cooperating family member. He was married. He did have 2 children, children and grandchildren. Other than that, knowing what he did for employment, I didn't get into anything else about him. That's about it.
Was he married at the time of the attack?
Yes.
And how old was he?
He was 43 years old at the time. I'm sorry, 42 years old at the time.
Did he have daughters of his own at that time?
Yes.
Is there any further investigation into seeing whether maybe there was some incest or anything like that that was committed?
No, they don't want to discuss anything further.
Just to clarify, is he originally from Wisconsin, and then what are the charges exactly that he faced in Wisconsin? Attempted rape, and then 3 counts of rape?
Yes, he is from Wisconsin, he's born in Wisconsin, and in 1958 is when he was first charged with attempted rape, and then went to prison. When he's released, he's on parole for a period of time until 1964. Then the next information we have on him is he's charged in 1972. I think March was the first, where he then is found deemed incompetent to stand trial, which I was unable to, well, in speaking to the cooperating family member, they said there was no mental health issues. So I don't know why that came about in 1972, but it did, and it's another state 40 years ago. And then again, he's charged with 3 counts of rape in 72 as well. It just says after that it was dismissed. There's no particulars on anything, and we're having great difficulty trying to find any. Yes, sir.
Were the other rapes also children, or were they adults?
We don't know. We have no records as of right now. When we spoke to officials in Wisconsin, still trying to see if we get lucky and find something. Again, you're talking 1958, and 1972. It's all pre-everything that we're used to today.
Now, you said Nichols died in '98, correct?
Yes.
Do you know how he died?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay. I figured I'd leave that hanging for you. He died of cancer.
When you mentioned getting a DNA sample from a cooperating family member, can you clarify, was that the family member's DNA, or was it, yep, that's right?
Yes.
Okay.
Family
So I'm
members.
nodding.
Okay. Yes, ma'am.
The girls seem to have given a pretty accurate description. I mean, they had his age pretty well pegged, in the age range. Did any of the other descriptions even come close to looking like him? I know he had aged since the event, so she wouldn't recognize him, but I guess you don't have any pictures of him at the time. You don't.
This photo actually that the sheriff had is in 1984, so it is. I just retrieved that photo along with one of my forensic girls yesterday, so I didn't have that at that exact time to show the victim. The ones I had shown her were probably 10 years, 12 years before and after is all I had available.
So they were pretty good eyewitnesses, really, just to get his age and that much.
Yes, especially for a 9-year-old, 10-year-old, and a 12-year-old child. When you think a 30-year-old person is old when you're 9,
Yeah.
And to clarify again, it was the 12-year-old who was raped by him?
Yes.
One thing I think it's important to talk about, and Detective Lorgan and I speak on a fairly regular basis. Obviously, this is something near and dear to law enforcement's heart. We really are frustrated when somebody gets away with something as serious as a sexual battery on a little girl or murder or something similar. And one of the loopholes, and it might not have helped in this particular case, but there are a lot of individuals out there with pretty significant criminal histories that are in prison and or that pass away and their DNA is unavailable, particularly when you look nationwide. As an example, there are people in prison right now that may have been arrested for something equally as serious and have been in prison for many, many years, maybe a couple decades or more. And throughout the nation, their DNA has not been taken and it's not in the system. Of course, when somebody passes away, their DNA typically is not taken, even if they have a pretty significant criminal history. But Detective Lorgan and I have talked, and we have the Florida Sheriff's Association has a cold case advisory committee, and one of the things they talk about on a fairly regular basis is the fact that there is a lot of DNA that is still not in the system. We're doing a great job of capturing people who have contemporaneous crimes where they've committed or been accused of committing a crime fairly recently. But the ones that are a little older, like this gentleman, and I'm not a betting person, but if I was a betting person that he had committed rapes, you know, many rapes go unsolved, many more go unreported. I would venture to say, and I think Detective Logan would agree, that he had committed, it's very, very, very likely that he committed rapes between the early 70s and the early 80s, and then again after he committed this rape. And that's one reason why we want to get as much information as we can into ViCAP. But that being said, if his, you know, he died in '98, which was again pretty much about the time DNA was just starting to get on the horizon. But there have been a lot of people who've passed away since then who've committed some pretty serious crimes, and if we had their DNA, we might be able to bring some resolution to some victims of some pretty serious crimes out there. So that's something else we want to get across. And Detective Lorgan and I have been talking to some people, and hopefully we're going to be able to get some movement on some DNA testing, particularly for prisoners, maybe even nationwide, who have not been tested. So anyway, does anybody else have any other questions or anything?
Do you see this ancestry DNA thing as a pretty cool thing for you guys?
What's that?
You guys see this ancestry DNA technology as something that will really, really benefit you on both.
Right, and this is kind of the long way around getting there, but if his DNA, for example, would have been in the state database or would have been put in later, you know, around the time he passed away, had it been available at that time, and of course people are passing away every day, that we would get hits, and it would certainly make this a whole lot easier than the path we had to take to solve this case. So that's my point, is if you get a profile, a full profile of DNA and get it in the database, there are a lot of full profiles out there of unknown suspects that could be solved. You know, and it wouldn't be that difficult, and it would bring a lot of closure, because there are a lot of cases out there with full DNA profiles, much like this one, without suspects, and that's frustrating for us. So.
Can you give the full name and spelling of his name again? I don't know.
Sure.
I know it's Nichols, but.
I'll put this up. It's William Lewis. We'll also be sending out a media release right after this with more details in it and so forth, and all the correct spelling. But it's William, common spelling, Lewis, Nichols. He's a white male. He was born on July 18th of 1941.
Can you hold up his photo one more time?
I'm sorry?
His
Hold
photo
on.
one more
Oh,
time.
a photo again? Sure. That's, this photo was taken roughly a year after the rape was taken. We were able to find it through some sources. We just found it yesterday, according to Detective Lorgren. So
Will you send that photo with your media release as well?
we can do that, sure.
Great.
Okay. Any other questions? Thank you all for coming. Thank you for helping us get this information out. Hopefully, this case will allow some other cases to be solved in Central Florida. So thank you all.